sincere commitments. We should feel free to make personal commitments to God that are based on God's future provisions. Here's Gene to explain.
Now, look at 1 Samuel 1, verses 10 and 11, where we pick up the story of Hannah and her pain, and we read, deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord. She wept with many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, Lord of hosts, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut. Now, we need to understand that this is based on the Nazirite vow, which is outlined in Numbers chapter 6. Has various applications to those who serve as priests. In this particular case, the vow is being made on the part of Hannah on the prayer that she might have a son. And then if she does and God answers that prayer, then she will devote him to the Lord totally according to the Nazirite vow. That vow could be a specific period of time, or it could be for a lifetime. And in her heart, when she made that vow, it was for a lifetime. She was saying, if you'll give me a son, he's yours. And yours in a very special way, as is defined there in the Old Testament. To serve the Lord in a very special way in the temple. And she was speaking that based on her knowledge of religion, her knowledge of God's plan, as limited as it was because of sin that had eclipsed a lot of what God had outlined within the Scriptures. But she knew enough about the Scriptures and about the writings of Moses that she understood this vow. And so she made that vow to the Lord. If you go through the passage, and you'll come to verses 17 and 18, we read, Eli responded, go in peace. Now, what you see in this situation between the verses is that Eli, who was the priest, looked over at her and saw her praying and crying, saw her mouth moving, didn't hear anything, and he said, you're drunk. When are you going to stop drinking? And so he totally misinterpreted her. And she said, you don't understand. Here's why I'm crying. Here's why I'm praying. And Eli understood once she explained it. Eli responded, here in verse 17, go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the petition you've requested from him. May your servant find favor with you, she replied to Eli. And then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer appeared downcast. In other words, this whole experience of prayer, this experience in interacting with Eli, getting his blessing, enabled her to dig out of her depression and to be able to no longer allow all of this hatred towards her to keep her in this state of desperation. So it's a fascinating story in terms of what God already began to do in her life. Now, don't miss the point here. What we're talking about could be related, for example, to Jacob's experience, which I call his conversion experience. Let me just make a statement here about Jacob's experience. Following his encounter with God at Bethel, he, Jacob, vowed, in this case, to give 1/10 of his material possessions to the Lord if God provided. This indeed was a prayer of faith. This was not manipulation. This was not saying, God, this is what I'm going to do if you'll bless me. He's saying, this is what I will do if you make it possible. I can't do it unless you make it possible. And so consequently, it's related to basically what Hannah was saying. If you make it possible, this is what I will do. And that's not manipulation. That's not control in the sense of I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. I'll do this for you, God, if you'll do this for me, which can be based very much on a selfish basis. But when you say, if you make it possible, this is the way I'll honor you. And that was the commitment that she was making. She wasn't bargaining with God. And I think we have the same basic concept within the New Testament in terms of what we might call a faith promise, in terms of our material possessions. For her, it was the child. For Jacob, it was his material possessions. But if you go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, Paul says this. He says, therefore I considered it necessary to urge the brothers to go on ahead of you and arrange in advance the generous gift you promised, so that it will be ready as a gift and not as an extortion. In other words, what he's basically saying to the Corinthians, I know you don't have it now, and I know you've promised to give it before you have it, but I'm just reminding you that you said, if you make it possible, Lord, that you'll follow through. And that's in essence what we have happening here. And so there isn't, it's not inappropriate to make faith promises based on if God does this, makes it possible, then I will indeed honor you in a special way. And that's exactly what Hannah was doing, I believe, here in this Old Testament setting. So that's why the principle reads this way, and let me restate it. We should feel free to make personal commitments to God that are based on God's future provisions. And so the reflection and response question is, how can we make a commitment to God that is not manipulative and conditional, but simply a promise to demonstrate our love and appreciation to Him for His mercy and grace? Well, as I think about that, the one thing that pops into my head and my heart, I hope, is that we don't give to get. We don't do things for God in order to get something out of Him. We give ourselves to the Lord, our time, our talents, our treasures, and it includes it all, in order to honor Him regardless of what happens on God's part. Now, I think He honors sincere hearts, but if our motive is to do something for God in order to get something out of Him, our motive is wrong. So we have to check our hearts. We have to check our motives. We need to keep our motives pure. For example, the New Testament says, honor one another above yourselves. Well, isn't it easy to say, I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine? I'll honor you if you'll honor me. I'll do this for you if you'll put a good word in for me. I don't think it's wrong under certain circumstances to say, would you put a good word in for me? But if we say, I'll put a good word for you if you'll put a good word for me, then it gets into the realm of manipulation, control, selfishness, and there we have an illustration of how manipulating God, or trying to, can get into our human relationships. And so we are to be unconditional, which is really tough, in our love and how we respond to the Lord and to people. Job illustrates that in a way that's beyond my comprehension. Though he slay me, yet I'll trust him. That's a tough concept to practice, to apply. And so, this is a powerful principle that emerges from the life of Hannah. And her commitment, and because it was unselfish, I really believe God honored it in a very, very special way.